The train now departing from platform 1 is a time machine from a different world. She set out from Brighton Works in 1875, such a long time ago that she was already a bit out of date when the very first aeroplane flew. And yet, somehow, she survived in this throwaway world to reach us after 125 years, and miraculously, she's as good as new. It seems the nation that invented the steam locomotive doesn't really like to throw it away. A whole century of trains survive, including many that were already hard at work 100 years ago. But they're not all tucked away on heritage lines like this hard-working trio on the Bluebell. Old and new still meet on the mainline network. The train that used to cross the channel meets the train that now goes under the channel. Arguably, Britain's greatest museum is on wheels. But to appreciate the nation's treasure house of trains, it does help to have a guide. And who better than the man who's owned the giant freight engine Black Prince for more than 30 years? The artist, David Shepherd. He is, he says, a man who loves giants, elephants and tigers, as well as steam locomotives. And his paintings of giants have featured in hundreds of thousands of prints.
I just love this baby of mine. The nightmare problems she causes me with the money worries ever since I bought her, but it's worth every penny when you're on the footplate actually enjoying it like this, even on a short run. That's what it's all about. I mean, there wouldn't be any point in owning 140 tons of engine unless you actually drive it sometimes. No point in having it.
Back in the 60s, David Shepherd helped to save several steam locomotives from the scrapyard. But it was only financially possible because of the elephants. His wildlife paintings gave him the cash to rescue steam engines from the scrapyard. Without the elephants, there would be no Black Prince today. He was also able to capture on canvas the dying days of steam in a way no camera could ever hope to. But where did his love of engines begin?
Daddy had a beautiful O-gauge model railway. We lived in Totteridge in North London, and I often wonder what the present owners of the house think, because he took over the best bedroom for his model railway, O-gauge, so it was big. And to get a better curve between Euston by the doorway and Crewe by the window, he bored a hole through the chimney breast to make a tunnel. So people living in the house now must wonder why the chimney smokes.
This chimney started smoking exactly 100 years ago, a product of the Longhedge locomotive works for the South Eastern and Chatham Railway. It's the classic 060 tender engine layout. By the beginning of the 20th century, most of the principles of good design were already established. So, did the steam engine change much in the next 60 years?
Not a great deal, really. The bulk of change was to do with new design in the sense of bigger and faster locomotives, more powerful locomotives. But the basic engineering was really the same from the 1800s onwards. I was given a very rare book a little while ago, which dated from 1850, and I was amazed at the quality of engineering and the design that was evident from reading this book, and that's 1850. So they must have progressed very, very quickly, and certainly by the turn of the century, as you can see when you look around you, there are locomotives which we consider to be comparatively up to date. It's only really after then when things like superheating of locomotives and the sheer size of what they was producing, I think, made any real fundamental change.
Change is so difficult to predict. This Lancashire mill looks like the Rock of Ages and was certainly built to last. But for all the imposing grandeur of the architecture, it couldn't survive economic change any more than the nearby Civic Hall. But the humble motive power of Victorian industry steams on. This Lancashire and Yorkshire engine would have served the mills and perhaps given the mill workers their first seaside outing when, in later years, up to 1 million people from the Manchester area alone would have headed for resorts like Blackpool. It's been beautifully restored and works on holidays and high days at the East Lancs Railway, where the sight of a self-propelled furnace still draws the crowds. Modern engine men tinker to keep it going, and children who've only seen Thomas the Tank Engine are torn between fear and wonder when they meet the real thing for the first time. A fragment of film from the turn of the century shows how little some railways have changed. It's the Metropolitan line to Amersham, already electrified and serving commuters just like it does today. Engine number 1 survives after working on the Met for nearly 70 years and will eventually be returned to steam. The most striking change is in the people, all stiffly formal 100 years ago, but they'd probably think of us as a scruffy lot, not a handlebar moustache in sight. At least one Victorian engine from the Midlands retired to the seaside, and today it's on Santa special duty.
Right, here we jolly go then.
This is the Swanage Railway, where they've succeeded in what Dr. Beeching found impossible, making their branch line a viable part of the local transport infrastructure, and that includes bringing families into town for their Christmas shopping.
Right, we're just leaving the station on a slight downgrade, heading to Corfe Castle.
For operational reasons, this train is top and tailed. In other words, there's another engine at the back pushing.
Right, the engine we got today is a little 1F locomotive from the LMS. Used to be at Staveley Ironworks. And it's doing very nicely on the Santa Specials today. Now we're just going up the upgrade into Corfe Castle from Norden. In truth, we're not really doing an awful lot of work because 257 Squadron's pushing us, but we had to do something.
Many people, including David Shepherd, believe steam engines are rather like horses, living things that will respond to kindly treatment.
A diesel, you see, I'm going to be controversial now, I stick my neck out, but I'm not a diesel fanatic because I believe a diesel to some degree is inanimate. It's like a car. You get in, switch on the ignition or whatever you do and it goes, but it won't respond like a steam engine. If a steam engine's half ill, it's sick, any fireman will tell you you'll get it home by talking to it or kicking it, loving it or hating it, and it'll respond, it'll get you back to the shed, and then it'll die on you. But it won't die in the middle of a main line like a diesel might.
If there is such a thing as a classic locomotive from 100 years ago, it would probably be the Terrier, the engine that always struggled to look as though it was in charge of the train, being completely dwarfed by its carriages.
precious little bits of engineering. The materials are slightly substandard in the sense they're made out of wrought iron instead of modern steels. But bear in mind, those terriers were made when there was no motor cars. Horse and cart was the main mode of transport apart from the railways. And so they were the Concorde of their day, really. But they're beautiful things, made like a watch. And these days, of course, we try and make them as authentic as we possibly can on rebuilding them. And it's a pleasure to have two of the little engines here.
The trains were getting heavier, so operating departments wanted more power, a familiar story throughout the 20th century. There was a new generation of engines from Brighton Works, but, as ever, the last person on the designer's mind was the bloke who'd have to wriggle between the frames every day to oil the motion of this latest machine designed for getting the masses to work.
They were really the modern commuter train, or I say modern, you know, the turn of the century commuter train engine. I'm not sure there was as many commuters in those days, but there's a very intensive service. And our South Eastern Railway H-class tank, and of course Birch Grove, used to run that type of traffic into London Bridge and Cannon Street and so on.
But what was this turn of the century steam engine like to drive?
This engine's peculiar insofar that it's got a vacuum brake for the train, an air brake for the engine, and if all else fails, we've got a hand brake to park it on. This big lever is not a brake, it's the reverser, and that is forward. And if we bring it back to that position, the engine goes backwards. It therefore follows that if it's in a position roughly in the middle, then strictly speaking it shouldn't go anywhere because the valves are set so that it doesn't. The engine hasn't got a gearbox, so it follows that if you like, bottom gear forwards is when the lever's there, and once it's underway you can what's called notch up, which brings this lever back up. So instead of steam going in for the whole of the travel of the piston, it's now going in for a smaller percentage of that travel. So, but to start the train off, we need the steam to go in for as much travel as we can. So we've now got a vacuum brake, the engine's in forward gear, we'll take the handbrake off, and then we're ready to go once the other train arrives. Right away for guard. Okay then. Steam coming out the front is from drain cocks, which just allow the surplus water to come out. Once the thing's underway and it's dry at the chimney, we can shut them up.
Birch Grove is living evidence that even 100 years ago, Stephenson's rocket was a museum piece.
I mean, rocket, it was built right at the sort of first quarter of the last century, wasn't it? I don't know when, you know, it's more than I do. But it didn't last that long. And by the time this century came about, we were really running around behind engines that didn't change that much. You know, they lasted until the end of steam. In fact, many of the classes did. They lasted 50 or 60 years before they went out in the days of BR at the end of steam. They were still running.
During the second decade of the century, there was something sinister stirring in the undergrowth, something born from the most terrible of circumstances. It was arguably the ugliest engine of all time, and certainly among the most difficult to drive. This is how the railways went to war, with the driver sitting sideways in an armoured contraption that ran on petrol. Only a train could carry the immense amounts of men and materials consumed by trench warfare, a train running on lightly laid, narrow-gauge rails. Of course, they tried the steam engine, but often with disastrous results.
Well, if you have a steam locomotive in a war situation, it is a very obvious piece of machinery. It makes smoke. At night you have a fire. It makes steam, which can be seen quite a way away, and therefore the enemy can have pot shots at it. And one shot in the right place on the steam locomotive, that's the end of the steam locomotive. You just have a pile of rubbish on the side of the track. They were seen at night. Obviously their fires were very, very bright. And great disadvantage there. Again, you could be got at. There was very limited protection for the crew. They could be shot at, and certainly if the locomotive blew up, they're not going to survive.
So the internal combustion engine entered the fray.
They could get up close to the front with quite a reasonable load. They could go over lightly laid track, and therefore they could approach the front with the ammunition. Heaven help the drivers who got hit, but they could approach right up to the front without being seen or without being heard, deposit their load, and then get out fairly quickly.
And that was another disadvantage of steam. It couldn't get out anywhere very quickly. This is a saddle tank engine called Peter, and this his long-suffering driver, who must wait a couple of hours every morning before there's enough steam pressure to go anywhere. While steam sat around simmering, the enemy was on the move. Was the First World War the beginning of the end for steam locomotion?
I believe it was. The crews certainly loved it. They could come home relatively clean at night unless they'd been shot. They didn't have to clean the thing out too heavily in the morning. You didn't have to spend 2.5 hours getting it ready to go again the next day. It must have been the beginning of the end for steam.
And they didn't stop making petrol and diesel locos when the war was over. This machine is of 1950s vintage. In fact, throughout the 20th century, narrow gauge was always more adaptive than its big brother. This is an electric locomotive, a machine weird enough to be borrowed for a Bond movie a few years ago. The motor rails, rapiers, simplexes, and all the other ugly ducklings moved easily from military life into Civvy Street. After all, where there was muck, there was money to be made.
After the war, after the Second War, they were actually used on road construction and big construction sites. Some of ours were used on construction of reservoirs in Essex, just pulling out all the muck while they were digging them out. They were used all over the place until the dumper truck killed them. The dumper truck is the death of the narrow gauge locomotive. Even the electric locos that we have were working in the 60s, certainly in the late 60s. And they were working right up to the last minute. And then the dumper trucks took over.
The Great War must have seemed a long way away to places like Dunster on the North Somerset coast. There's a siding at the station here which enabled the wealthy family at nearby Dunster Castle to entertain visiting polo teams. People were beginning to go to the seaside. In later years, it came to be known as a holiday.
What a different world it was then. I mean, one's kids, if they've got the money, fly to Hong Kong now and all over the world. The world's so small. But in those days, it was an adventure for family shepherd. My brother, my sister and myself to go with Mummy and Daddy to build sandcastles on the coast at Birchington. I don't know why we chose Birchington. It's near Ramsgate, near Margate. That was the great summer holiday for 2 weeks. But Daddy was a mad nut for steam engines. That's where I get it from, of course. He was LMS, maroon coaches and all that. And he said, oh, we don't want to build sandcastles, David and Peter and Judy. Let's go and watch the steam trains go by. So we spent the entire fortnight's holiday hanging on the level crossing gauge, watching these steam trains go by. That was my first introduction to steam railways. It was in my blood from that moment.
The steam engine, meanwhile, was continuing to grow more muscular. This was the sexiest thing on wheels in the Great War era, Churchward's classic mogul design for the Great Western.
Thank you.
The bark of the exhaust was music to the ears when the engine, normally kept on the Severn Valley Railway, went to the West Somerset on a brief visit.
These are mixed traffic, so general purpose. They're not an express engine, but they're middle of the range, shall we say. Both for goods work and passenger work. They worked on branch lines, as they did on Minehead branch in the olden days. So 30 years ago, you'd have seen engines like this going up and down every day. Nigel's just about to drop off the single line staff, which has been our authority to travel from Blue Anchor to Minehead. There's only one of those, so that means as a single line we know there's nothing going to come and meet us halfway. Little bit of effort now just to get us into the platform. Keep an eye out here and make sure all our happy passengers aren't standing too close to the platform edge. And a little bit of brake in there. And hopefully to bring ourselves to a stop by the stop board.
The 260 mixed traffic engine was a mainstay of the big four companies that ran Britain's railways until 1948. This was a Gresley variant. And this, a southern type that David Shepherd was to sketch at his local Guildford shed at the very end of steam. It was engines like these pressed into passenger service on summer Saturdays that so many people fondly remember. Images of childhood from that age of innocence.
I didn't see it as romance in those days, because it is now. It's romance and nostalgia, but in those days it was part of the everyday scene, I suppose. But I was a young kid, I was just 3 or 4 years old. It was exciting. And it still stays, you see, with Thomas the Tank Engine. If you take your tiny grandchildren to a toy shop now, if they want if they want a train set for their birthday, you go to a big toy shop, and I guarantee you most of those train sets will have steam engines in them.
In the 1920s, early members of the castle class had a publicity value out of all proportion to their revenue-earning capacity. They were the window dressing of a business whose real trade was being carried out in the backyard, and that business was freight. Hundreds of thousands of goods wagons were endlessly shuffled around the country in a slow-motion dance that went on 24 hours a day. goods trains had the uncanny knack of making themselves almost invisible. You didn't know where they were going or what they were carrying. They were just there, the background noise of everyday life. Santa's little helper, for instance, spent no less than 86 years just running backwards and forwards in yards that were only a stone's throw from her home shed, adding a few bob every day to the Midland Railway balance sheet. That was in the days when almost everything went by rail, when the lifeblood of the nation was her trade with the rest of the world. Manufactured goods went out, raw materials came in, and were whisked away by train.
Anything you wanted, the railways were common carriers, and they would carry virtually anything, provided it would fit into the loading gauge, fit through the tunnels and fit under the bridges. Then the railway would carry it for you. There would be open wagons carrying coal, maybe, closed wagons with animal feedstuffs protected from the weather. The railway had a range of vehicles, wagons with a limited amount of heating in, so that they could carry perishable fruit in the winter without it freezing and becoming and destroying. And parcels traffic, mail order came by train largely, and the railway ran a fleet of minivans and wagons and horse-drawn trucks and so on, depending on which part of their history you look at, which connected with the services.
The pace of life for trains like this was decidedly slow. Before long they'd be stuck in a siding again, where no doubt the eventual green flag would interrupt a good chat.
Right, a tip from the guard, better go. See you all. The handbrake's off, when did it? Off, yeah. Alright, got a tip from the guard, we're on the move again. Unfitted freight, so we won't do much in the way of speed. Throttle on steady. Well, the locomotive we're on at the moment was very much built for the branch line use that it's seeing in preservation. Built for branch line workings with 1 or 2 coaches, or as we are today with some trucks in the days when the railways used to take freight. So we're very much, if you like, recreating the branch line atmosphere that our grandparents would have seen in the 30s and 40s when the railways used to shift a great deal more freight than it does today.
The great railway works became the biggest factories in Britain. The young David Shepherd was a visitor to Swindon.
Everywhere I looked was a fantasy world of excitement. Green engines and in bits, wheels and all the gubbins. But the workforce made it such a thrill for me. They were super because they pulled every string they could to make me happy. Just in Swindon Works, for example, it was in the summer and I'd been painting for about 5 days, and I got to know all the lads, in this particular erecting shop. And one guy bought a whole bag of fresh strawberries out of his allotment to put on my easel while I was working. Now, those little memories were so lovely because they shared with me my love of steam. They loved steam. They weren't just workers in a factory. It was a life to them, like coal miners. And they were heartbroken when steam finished and they were all thrown on the scrap heap. I spent, for example, 3 weeks in Crewe Locomotive Works when they had 6,000 people employed in that loco works. And they had to put a screen around me in the end because I was disturbing the workforce. They were all watching me paint, so they had to put a screen around me. But I was painting this big painting of Crewe Works, which BR subsequently bought for £60, and I think it's in the National Railway Museum collection. And they were to paint in those conditions. They were carrying Duchess Pacifics over my head on travelling cranes, while I was underneath painting.
A railway career often began with the job of cleaner.
Bruin, this is the chargeman cleaner. He'll tell you what to do. Arthur, I want you to get a set of men on 4237 for me. Righto. Come on, boy.
Harry has started on the first stage of his career. From now until his working life is finished, he will be concerned with locomotives. Locomotives of all kinds and sizes, tank engines and tender engines, sturdy little shunters and giant expresses.
Young Harry would have been impressed with this giant express in absolutely immaculate condition. But it's taken days to achieve, including attention to hundreds of servicing details, many of them underneath the engine.
The locomotive weighs 89 to 90 tonnes. That weight obviously being distributed through its main driving axles and through its front two bogie axles, all of which have to be thoroughly lubricated, lubricating all the rods, the axle boxes behind here, all the outside motion. On the inside there, all the reverser arm gear, moving forward, the crosshead, the slide bars, connecting rod, piston rods. Looking onto the top of the engine, in there are over 20 pots of oil, all of which have got to be maintained. Just moving on to the front valve rod, knuckle joints, rocking arms, inside pistons down below and valve gear on the top. Front bogie axle, bogie boxes, moving round onto the front of the engine, lubricating pots there for the valve gear rods under these covers.
One trip and it's all got to be done again. But there wasn't just one engine to clean. Sheds like Old Oak Common had 100 locomotives on the books, and shed foremen struggled to keep machines clean when they were always needed back in traffic. The engine that had pulled goods trucks all week was likely to be rostered for excursion traffic at the weekend. And a long way away in the countryside at the end of the chain, the tank engine driver was suddenly a busy man with no time to stop for a chat. His branch line was becoming the bottleneck that threatened to bring the whole railway network to a standstill. Here, the signalman's operating level crossing gates, doing his best to keep the growing volume of road traffic moving without hampering the flow of trains, in this case trains to Minehead. The signalman's dog seems to find it tiring just watching. When trains were late, the pressure was very much on the lonely signalman.
The railway is divided into sections controlled by signal boxes, and quite often there would be a train at every signal in every section. And the numbers which were carried in the 1950s, following the development of holidays after the war, just brought the railway to almost crisis point on Saturdays. The station was extended by the Great Western Railway in 1936 to accommodate trains of up to 19 coaches in length. and this was because the railway was so busy. Mine had developed following the advent of the railway as people started to travel by train to their holiday destinations. If you imagine the west of England without the motorway network, without all the fine dual carriageway roads, and imagine much lower car ownership, then the trains, and to a lesser extent bus services and coach services, they were the only way to get here. So this place would have been absolutely hectic.
For little boys, anticipation turned to gratitude at journey's end.
You went up and thanked the engine driver. You don't do that anymore. There was romance. He got you safely to your destination with your bucket and spade, and it was lovely, and you looked up at the cab, and there was the glowing fire on his face, and it was magic. It was fantasy land for kids. I was one of them. I was one of those archetypal little boys with his cloth cap and his bucket and spade.
On lines like this, average speeds were well below 30 miles an hour and stayed that way forever. But on the main line, it was a different story. The London and North Eastern Railway was about to unveil a flying machine. Any detail of this locomotive is instantly recognisable to any steam enthusiast. It was, of course, the fastest class of engine ever built, ensuring a place in transport history for its designer. The A4 Pacific was Sir Nigel's entry in the race to the north, between the LMS up the west coast to Glasgow and the LNER via the east coast to Edinburgh. Streamlining was all the rage in the 30s, and the Big Four all eventually experimented with air smoothing, though it only stuck completely in this one class. But was it art?
Very interesting question, because being an artist, I've got very strong views on art, and I don't like Art Deco, and to me, this will upset the Nigel Gresley people. They're great guys, of course they are. But I personally don't like steam engines that are streamlined. It's purely my personal opinion. Why shouldn't I say it? I don't like a streamlined engine because I like to see all the workings. But Nigel Gresley, being a sort of Art Deco 1930s Odeon cinema type thing, you know what I mean, Odeon cinema, that's Art Deco to me. And he said, well, we've got to make it streamlined and cover all the working parts, ostensibly to presumably make it go faster. I personally don't like it. In any case, they took most of the streamlining off, didn't they, because it was more practical not to have it all over the wheels.
Opinions may vary on how it looked, but not on how it went. 6007 was for a while the only member of the original class of 34 locomotives to be running in regular traffic. Here she's being prepared at Bury for a canter along the East Lancashire Railway.
You give us a drink bag up there.
Clear this side.
Okay, got the green on the ground. Right, shut the tap, Tommy.
I don't know where the sea waymen are, Roger.
Staff in the running hall, don't we?
Yeah, I'm out. Can you get up with me?
heritage line, she's limited to 25 miles an hour, which is, of course, just over 100 miles an hour slower than Mallard. But nevertheless, it is easy to imagine the thrill of that non-stop dash to Scotland. Meanwhile, on the LMS, Stanier was planning his revenge, the Coronation Pacifics.
The rhythm of the exhaust grows stronger, faster, 112.5 miles an hour for 2 miles, smoothly surging over the metals. A supreme effort, and Coronation has done it. 114 miles an hour, the highest speed yet attained in the Empire.
Of course, the A4s had the last word on top speed. Meanwhile, at the Millennium, there was talk of rebuilding Duchess of Hamilton to the streamlined form of the 30s.
Another controversial subject. I'd like to see it, because it reminds me of my generation. My dad, you see, was LMS, streamlined Duchess Pacifics. Yeah, they were hideous in my view, but it's all part of the evolution of the steam railway engine, you know, so why not? I don't like it, but that's beside the point.
This engine was but a twinkle in its designer's eye in the 30s, but the type of train it's pulling was a feature of pre-war Britain. Speed was one thing, but wealthy people also wanted to travel in style and have a good lunch. The Pullman Car Company Limited understood the needs of the inner man. This is how the other half lived on trains like the Queen of Scots, the Brighton Belle and the Golden Arrow. It's an age which is vanishing quickly, but the people who run the Orient Express were determined the elegance of that era would not disappear completely. So, one by one, they've restored the old Pullman cars into a stunning train. It can cost the best part of £500,000 to refurbish each car. Every one of them is distinctively different, which can mean searching the whole country for the right materials or the right craftsman. And each of these vehicles has a story to tell, like the car that's nowadays known as Phoenix.
The car has actually been renamed Phoenix. Originally she was called Rainbow, but she was damaged by fire before the war and was rebuilt with a completely new body in 1951 and renamed Phoenix after the Greek mythology legend of the bird rising from the ashes. And you will see, if we move towards the end of the car, that we have taken up the theme of the name in the washroom, which has the legendary bird rising from the ashes on the floor.
At their peak, the railways directly or indirectly employed 1 million people. And back in the 30s, every little boy wanted to be an engine driver. Companies like the London, Midland and Scottish had large publicity departments to cater for the popular curiosity about what life was like on the railways.
The system of training men for the footplate has been carefully devised to ensure that nothing is lacking, either in practical working experience or in theoretical training. Different classes of locomotives are designed to haul particular types of trains. So, as time goes on, Jim handles an increasing variety of locomotives and trains. He becomes a regular driver.
And if he was lucky, a driver like young Jim might eventually get his hands on one of the new Stanier mixed traffic engines that were eventually to form the biggest single class of British steam locomotives, the legendary Black 5.
If you had to choose one particular design of steam locomotive, of the whole lot, whatever you choose, somebody will contest it. But I believe that very, very, very rarely man designs a perfect machine. I've said this, reference my painting of Black 5 Country, the Black 5s at Stoke-on-Trent. I would say the Black 5. It's like an aeroplane. You know, the DC-3 Dakota, the only replacement is another one. It just happened to be perfect. It's a legendary aeroplane. Same with the Black 5. 840-something from 1930-something until the 1950s, they were building them, right? They were workhorses. They worked in the most appalling conditions towards the end of steam, but they went on working. And I believe, stick my neck out, that's a perfect design for a steam engine. Nobody's ever bettered it.
Only 4 of the 842 engines carried names in BR service, but this one, running recently on the Met, has been subsequently named RAF Biggin Hill, a memory of the dark days of war when the Black Fives did some of their finest work. David Shepherd can remember the effect the war had on Britain's railways.
They were hammered. They were absolutely hammered into oblivion. But they played a massive part in World War II, D-Day. God, you know, the railways were an integral part of our transport system. All the soldiers coming back from Dunkirk, famous scenes, never to be repeated. It's part of our history. Without the railways, what would we have done? Goodness knows, heaven knows.
Special trains were hurriedly assembled, and in the space of 8 days, 620 specials were run from 7 ports in the southeast of England.
We had one weapon that Captain Mannering would dearly have liked at Warmington-on-Sea. It was something to make the Hun think twice.
The Rumney-Hythe and Dymchurch, which we all know, I was born and bred on that railway in Kent, back to Kent again, you see, runs from Dymchurch to Rumney. Lovely little, beautiful engines. God knows how old they are now, 2 Hurricane and Green Goddess, you know, they're famous. But during the war, it was the deterrent to Hitler. We turned them, everybody knows this, it was an armoured train. We covered Hurricane in sort of metal cladding, tin plate. I don't know why we imagined that, but anyway, Hitler obviously saw this and thought, oh my God, I'm not going to invade England with that in the way. You know, it's a joke, it was all Dad's army, but it was serious. But somebody said to me once anyway that Hitler would never have been able to invade or get as far as London anyway, because he wouldn't have been able to understand the Southern Railway timetable. I don't know who told me that.
The British humour was being stretched to the limit by 1940.
Incendiaries by the thousands set fire to property, but a train couldn't dodge a plane or a bomb. It just had to stop or keep on. And keep on they did. Deeds of heroism by railwaymen and women were legion.
Out of the despair of war came a machine that was guaranteed to cheer you up. A machine that would still look comical, however much you polished it. And thankfully the National Railway Museum have kept the joke alive so that Grandad can take a video to amuse the kids, or Stepney can go about his business with a happy face. The fireman is just relieved that someone else is rostered on that other engine. And all these years later, small boys still look concerned when they see what Mr. Bullard built to help the war effort. Don't be fooled by that golden arrow headboard and don't think for a minute that they haven't put all the bits on yet. This is it, the finished article. The Q1 goods locomotive built for the Southern Railway. But will it still bring a smile to Mr. Shepherd's face?
Yes. Oh, goodness me, yes. Well, that was an austerity locomotive. I mean, it is austerity. But Bullied had a job to do, and he designed it to fulfill a purpose. A short-lived engine, probably, just literally at the end of the war, when materials were scarce, raw materials, and it worked. Didn't matter what it looked like. But it's got a sort of special niche now in the preservation movement because it's so extraordinary. Yeah, the Ugly Duckling.
Bullard had the last laugh. The engine turned out to be the most powerful 060 tender locomotive ever built in Britain, with a power-to-weight ratio of a sports car, if only the driver could prevent the wheels spinning around.
a moderately good engine to drive, but there are problems with it being light in weight. It tends to be what we would call light on its feet. It'll pick the wheels up very easily if you're not careful. If you open the regulator too quickly and too fast, you'll slip. But that apart, it's a very strong engine, and it's reasonably well set out. When the engine first came out, one of the leading designers from another railway looked at it very cynically because of its appearance, and he asked the designer of the engine, "Where do you put the key?"
Nowadays, engines are kept in a condition that was rarely seen in steam days. But what state were they in at the end of the war?
Flogged to death, yeah. And the railways were flogged to death. They never recovered from World War II. And then if you want me to be really political, somehow the great spirit of the railways, the four grouping, LNER, LMS Southern and GWR, the spirit went out so much when they were nationalised. The drivers, the old drivers, didn't know who they were working for. It became a faceless, megalithic organisation. And then came beating. And I don't think the railways have ever recovered. We had the opportunity after World War II to think, God, we'll have a transport policy, an integrated transport policy, which we're talking about now, but we don't do it. An integrated transport policy, trams, roads, electric traction, steam or diesel, roads and railways in other words, but we lost the opportunity.
What nationalisation didn't stop was the partisan debate about which railway had built the best engines. Was it the Great Western 460, which had, after all, set the standard early in the century? Was it the Gresley designs? Many people believe the V2 mixed traffic locomotive was an absolute war winner. Does the crown rightly belong to Sir William Stanier? Or were Bulleid's engines, after rebuilding, the best of the lot? There is, of course, no objective answer. The designs were years apart, the needs of each railway were different, as were the functions of each locomotive type. But that doesn't stop the arguments about design, though David Shepherd, for one, won't be drawn.
You'd have to ask somebody who's more technically knowledgeable than I am about this sort of thing, because I come back to the point, I just love steam engines. I don't know much about the history, really, I don't care. It's what Black Prince does to me when I'm on a footplate, that's what matters.
Whistle. Steam brake off, okay. The brake off on the tender brake off. Right. Still want the tops open, do you?
I think we can close them now.
Close them. Right. It's a bit quieter with them closed.
Halfway through a turbulent century, it might have seemed to railwaymen as though there'd been quite enough change already. Whereas actually the pace of change was increasing, and Britain's railways were heading for revolution. Was there still a role for that faithful old kettle on wheels? Wartime austerity measures meant there was little new in the way of mainline motive power at the time of nationalisation. Among the notable exceptions were Bulleid's two types of Pacific passenger locomotive. This is the rebuilt West Country version, minus its spam cam casing and controversial chain-driven valve gear and enclosed oil bath. What it did have was a brilliant boiler and a firebox fabricated in steel.
The steam, like anything with the boilers, a superb boiler. That's one of the pluses of the locomotive. It's a modern design of boiler if you can have a modern steam engine. And it's got a steel firebox, which is steel is obviously weldable. Copper is much more difficult to do. Just a great design of boiler.
The nationalised railways were planning to standardise locomotive design under Riddles, who'd been Stanier's right-hand man on the LMS. There was a lot they could learn from engines like Tall Valley, but lesson number one was not to get involved in too many design experiments which had plagued these otherwise excellent southern engines. The West Country's footplate, complete with electric lighting and comfy seats, was a thoroughly modern layout, and Riddles would have been impressed by its steam-raising capacity. But his job was not an easy one.
He came in as nationalisation started, didn't he, 1947, 48, and was charged with making a standard class of locomotives which would suit each region. And from that point of view, I think he's been very successful, but it must have been a little bit of a poison chalice because everybody wanted to go in their direction at that time, and he had to pull the whole lot together and make very viable and less labour-intensive locomotives which would run the railway, as it turns out, into the mid-60s.
One way of making a locomotive less labour-intensive is to limit it to 2 outside cylinders so that the motion is accessible. And why not make sure someone else has already designed out the bugs? Riddles needed to look no further than the best of Midland locomotive design, like this tank engine. Ivert's Class 2 locomotive was to become one of the blueprints of standard design. The roomy cab was typical of a practical design which had already been tested on regions other than the Midland. Southern railwaymen still remember them fondly.
When they came out, they replaced, because Bricklayers Arms used to have a lot of carriage sidings all over the place. Blackheath, Maysdale, Grove Park, they were where they kept empty coaching stock. And some of the jobs we had at Bricklayers Arms was to get hold of one of these C-Class, H-Class stamp, get hold of these coach, and you'd run around all day with this coaching into different places while it was cleaned and washed, pick it up in the city in the morning and take it back in the evening. All day you was on these trains and these little H-Class tanks. Along come the Ivett tank and they made the job a lot easier because there was plenty of room, nice roomy cab. The only thing was that we found that if you dropped back to 160 pound of steam, the brakes started going on. It was something we learnt the hard way. You know, we was going up over the arches into London and we were coming to a stand with a vacuum brake going on. There was a reason for it, but we found out what it was after a while.
As well as the 262 layout, Riddles and his designers adopted the LMS 264 layout for the Class 4 tank that was to become one of the most successful of all the standard designs. And they hadn't forgotten the Black 5 either. A higher running plate, bigger driving wheels and slightly more power were included in the standard Class 5 machine that was eventually to find its way onto some of the heaviest trains, rostered alongside much bigger engines. Some of these much admired middleweights were even given names. This one is Camelot. This is the Class 4 tender engine, introduced in 1951. By now, the engineers had done nearly all they could. They played about with double chimneys, exotic valve gear and boilers, even mechanical stokers, and built a single 3-cylinder engine, the Duke of Gloucester. But what they couldn't do was attract young lads to a career on the railways in a world where labour was scarce and where there were easier ways to earn a living, especially in the depths of winter. The bottom line is that the steam engine will always need a 2-man crew. It has built-in labour costs that can't be reduced.
The cost of things changes. This Bluebell Railway couldn't survive without voluntary effort, because that degree of manpower it's not viable to purchase that. In engineering terms and railway terms, things changed. Things became easier to operate. Less manpower was needed to look after an engine. Things like the grates were rocking, so that you didn't have to shovel it all out at the end of the day. You could just drop it through into the ash pan. You pull a lever and all the ash would just drop out the bottom of that. No end of things. Lubrication was made easier, purely to not have so many men on the ground. The cost of materials went down, the cost of labour went up.
The 50s were the most fascinating time, I think, in our railway heritage, because that's when the standard locos were designed and came in a last dying gasp, I suppose, to try and make steam engines viable commercially. And Black Prince, of course, my engine, was only 8 years old when I bought her, and the 17th last locomotive to be built, and would have been scrapped years before her time.
The job of fireman was one of the least understood and most responsible on the railways. Towards the end of steam, lads of 16 or 17 were thrown into a man-sized role, and not all of them stayed the course. The engine driver was unlikely to leave the job, but the turnover in firemen was colossal.
A lot of documentaries are always written or filmed about the driving side of a steam locomotive. It's the thing that people see the most, are the questions we're always after you, the driver. But some people want to know about the firing side, and for my mind, the fireman's job is actually the more difficult. He's got a very difficult balancing act to perform. He needs to keep sufficient boiler pressure for the locomotive to work. He needs to keep sufficient water in the boiler to stop it from exploding. He needs to keep a good, decent, efficient fire that will keep the water temperature hot and therefore provide the steam. He's got to provide the steam to the driver's requirements. If the driver starts using a lot of steam, he'll use a lot more water. And the more water that's being used means more coal has to be put on. And on top of that, if that's not enough, he's got to sweep the floor and keep a good lookout and observe and obey and relay all instructions to the driver.
Lads who joined the railways towards the end of steam can still remember the horror of their first encounter with a dying industry.
Well, I started as a cleaner in 1962, 15 years old, filthy, stinking engine shed. The only modern thing in there were the electric lights in the roof. Everything else was from the last century, really. I've never seen anything like it in my life, but I stuck with it. And you start off as an engine cleaner, and that is cleaning the outsides of them, not the insides, as some people thought. So you just basically clean steam engines until you were 16, in which time you started your firing training.
When Malcolm Hall joined the railways in 1962, a lot of the shunting work was already being done by diesel. This humble box on wheels had been around since the mid-50s, and it'll still be with us well into the 21st century, arguably one of the greatest locomotive designs of all time. But it did steam no favours. This was the scene at Barry Island in South Wales. The date is 1967, and Di Woodham's yard is overflowing. British Railways were rushing to get rid of steam, even though some of the engines were almost brand new. However, give them a few months in the sea air and they'd all look ready for the cutter's torch. And a whole generation of railwaymen were thrown on the scrap heap too.
They shared with me my love of steam. They loved steam. They weren't just workers in a factory. It was a life to them, like coal miners. You know, they were heartbroken when steam finished, and they were all thrown on the scrap heap with the engines. You know, because I knew them from Guildford Shed, just down the road from where I lived. Got to know all the lads, and there were tears, you know, when steam finished. They closed the shed because they were chucked away as well.
David Shepherd was determined to save one of the mighty 9Fs.
The 9Fs were the ultimate in steam locomotive design, and thrown away years before their time. It was a monstrous waste of money. We were chucking them away when they were built. We were actually throwing away 9Fs. I think they built 251 of the 9F class, and some were being thrown away for razor blades while we were still building new ones.
Should Riddles's masterpiece have been discarded so quickly?
I think if you look at the last design, the 9F, the heavy freight locomotive, it was so versatile, an extremely powerful locomotive. It could pull passenger trains. They were not maintenance free, but easy to maintain, relatively speaking. And I think you've got to judge the man on that. That's the way they were going. But he never really finished his job, did he? Because change of emphasis, you know, over to dieselisation and electrification, he never really finished what he was doing. But yeah, I think he was successful.
To understand why these engines were mourned, all you have to do is ask a railwayman.
Well, it's a lot more comfortable because you've got a nice seat and you've got this at the back of you, and you've got a tender that is more or less covers the whole thing in. So they were more creature comforts, as they say, on the standard engines than a lot of other engines, even LNER engines, where there was low tenders.
The opinion of the engine driver counted for very little in a world of change, and soon whole classes of engine were mirages in the memory. The Kings had gone as early as 1962. The Bullids would escape the executioner for up to 5 years longer.
The frenetic dying days of steam in 1967 in the south of England, where I live. I took 3 weeks off. I could barely afford it because I was frantic doing elephant pictures, you know, to pay the bills for all this. Commissions of elephants and wildlife, which I was doing by now. But I thought I've got to record something onto canvas, so I took 3 weeks, either 9 Elm Shed at Waterloo or Guildford Sheds. In fact, I'd be painting a picture of elephants all day for somebody, and I'd bung my easel and paints into the Land Rover and charge off to Guildford Shed, and just no legality about it. The shed must say, I don't care what you do, mate, it's all falling apart anyway, you know, don't bother with a footplate pass or anything. Spent half the time riding on illegal footplate passes, doing ballast trains around Aldershot, all illegal. That's another story. But I had to record something, if just colour sketches, you know, quick notes, because, okay, a colour camera can record to some degree authentic colour, but it cannot, I'm sounding pompous now, but I don't think it can compete with the brain and the eyes of an artist.
One by one, the rusty relics were recovered from Barry Island. Without Dye Woodham, there would be no steam sanctuaries like this, places that were built just like Noah's Ark to save the various species of steam, although sadly not all of them survive. Often, it was schoolboys who showed the way, using pocket money and the optimism of youth to buy the first engines for preservation. This was the day that 1466 came back to life. The boys had to run for a box of matches so they could light the fire. Mr. Woodham agreed to delay cutting up the last of the engines so that enthusiasts had as much leeway as possible for fundraising. Youngsters would tour the scrapyard looking for bits and pieces which could be salvaged. The cost of remanufacturing lost components was to prove astronomical in later years. But a few engines never went to the scrapyard at all. The Merchant Navy locomotive Clan Line was earmarked for preservation years in advance.
These engines ceased to run in 1967. For the last 3 or 4 years of their service life, a whole group of us used to go around on the southern region, recording them, photographing them, travelling behind them. And it was fortunate that it was announced about 2 years before they actually stopped running that they were going to come to the end of their lives. And we simply decided that we didn't want to do without them. So we clubbed together and put adverts in the enthusiast press asking for donations to see if we could get enough money actually to preserve one. It was all done with the giddy innocence of use. We had no idea what we were taking on. We had no idea what we were going to do with it if we did manage to buy it. But we persevered, and we've eventually managed to raise £2,200, which was the scrap value of the locomotive in those days, and bought it.
So by Clan Line, I was involved with Clan Line, which is now on the main line, bless her. And we were selling biro pens and calendars for 2 shillings each in Old English money to raise the money. Clan Line cost, I think, 1,200 quid. That was the scrap value. And we bought her, and now she's running like Black Princess. So I think we did achieve a lot, we really did. Amazing.
Today, Clan Line pops up all over southern England. Here she crosses the River Ada at Shoreham after delivering people for a Glen Miller evening at the local airport. It's a curious twist of fate that steam survived longer than British Railways, whose propaganda films from the 70s included the astonishing claim that motorways were losing out.
In the 1960s and on into the 70s, trains were winning passengers back from the internal airlines and from the motorways. They did it by improving the ride, by increasing comfort, by running, as they always have, city centre to city centre, and above all, by shortening journey times for intercity travellers.
There were big achievements like the electrification of the West Coast Main Line. But this odd-looking diesel is living evidence that not all was well with our nationalised railway system. There's nothing wrong with a design philosophy that tries to give the driver a grandstand view of what's going on around him. The trouble was, BR was commissioning all sorts of non-standard designs and later throwing them away because they weren't standard. This class started appearing in 1964. Some of them lasted just 2 years. It was an appalling waste of national resources. This much-loved class, on the other hand, is still going strong after 40 years, even if it does look like one of Doctor Who's Daleks when first viewed head-on. It had one huge built-in design fault. The drivers were complaining they couldn't see past that great long nose when running in the forward direction. So these engines spent most of their lives coupled in pairs, with a cab at each end. And this particular individual removed spoil from the Channel Tunnel, before retiring to the Bodmin and Wenford Railway. Meanwhile, back in the 70s, Lord Haw-Haw appeared to be alive and well and working for BR.
The romance of steam. Yes, for some romance, for others, muck everywhere. In your eyes, your ears, in your hair. Now, between London, Southampton and Bournemouth, electricity sweeps all that away. Commuting to London from what used to be faraway places is now so easy.
The message seemed to be that third rail was a new invention, and that Austin 1100 owners from Bournemouth couldn't wait to get crushed in a crowd in London every day. David Shepherd remembers it well.
You know, I mean, I have to accept, look, let's face it, in spite of all my nostalgia and my love of the past, we have to accept that steam had to go in the end. For one simple reason, you would not get a young guy now to do what those young firemen had to do. You know, just imagine leaving Euston to go to Crewe on a Duchess Pacific, how many tons of coal you'd have to shift. You sweated your gut out to do that job. And a diesel is much cleaner, it's much more, I nearly said efficient. Well, it probably is more efficient, I don't know, electric. So that's one reason why steam died. It was dirty. I bemoan the passing because I'm in Liverpool Street. We used to live in Essex eventually, and we used to come into London, into Liverpool Street, to go to the theatre with Daddy and Mummy, and I'd have my suit on, and by the time I'd left Liverpool Street, I was like a fireman myself. I mean, everything in Liverpool Street was covered in 3 inches of soot and filth. Lovely, wonderful, but the modern age wouldn't accept that. It's all clean now, it's like a greenhouse. No, that's the modern age we live in, and it has to come.
The clean and green modern age has not only come, for many diesel locomotives the modern age has come and gone. Nowadays the traction that displaced steam is often a museum piece itself, like this Class 25 engine working an enthusiast special on the West Somerset Railway. Half the population of Britain can't even remember steam, and to them classic traction is a diesel engine. This fabulous Western class engine was, by 1961, the third generation of mainline diesel to run on Brunel's hallowed railway, but hydraulic traction was deemed non-standard by the organisation that had built it. And so this was generation number 4, the Class 50. They weren't built for the southwest of England at all, but for the northwest. When that plan changed, BR drafted them onto the Paddington services, confident that they'd stay there well into the next century. Of course, they didn't. Another fine engine which many enthusiasts believe was chucked away long before its time, and now, like Deltic, is to be seen creeping back onto mainline duty. Since privatisation, these classic diesels have been recognised as still very usable for frontline service. Others, like the 33s, disappeared gradually and had almost gone by the time their absence was really noticed. While the various classes of diesel came and went, One in particular appeared to be timeless. The 47, diesel's equivalent of the Black 5, seen here scurrying away from Eastleigh like a bat out of hell as it goes in search of its train. And one that may last even longer, the 37. The leading engine will end up at the National Railway Museum. All of these engines are being chased away by the North American Brigade, whose invasion bridgehead was the mighty Class 59 that so revolutionised traction in this country when it started removing the mendips in rather large chunks. The plan is for the new 66s to sweep away most of the 60s stuff. These are literally just off the boat at Newport. But it's interesting to note that even they are being pushed around by one of those old diesel shunters that have found their way into every corner of the railway network. The one doing the pushing and shoving at Newport is of a batch built way back in 1961. But the future of these diesel shunters seems assured by their new American owner, who's announced that he too is reluctant to let them go.
We've got about 200 or 300 left within EWS, and they're used mainly for shunting in yards and sidings where, you know, to waste a bigger locomotive is not good use of resources. They've been tremendous stalwarts of our railway network for many, many years, and I think we're going to see them for many, many years to come.
But what about the 47, like this one, at the head of a travelling post office train sweeping through Newport on the day yet another batch of 66s arrive? Can EWS guarantee that the 47s would still be around in a few years' time?
I mean, they're still a very popular machine with the drivers and also with the general enthusiast. There'll be a few around for about another 2 or 3 years, but then I think most of them will probably have gone. They've done tremendous work, you know, up and down the country for many years, and it'd be sad to see them go.
If I had the money and I wanted to buy diesel, I'd buy a 47. Yeah, I think they're fine engines. That's nice. I've got to be fair to the diesel fanatics sometimes.
The growl of the 37 will be with us for longer. At least the more heavyweight members of the class will, having proved their reliability over many years.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, certainly there's going to be one or two. I think one at the National Railway Museum, which you know, will be donated to them when it's finished its life within EWS. Clearly, they've still got a future with us, as some of the heavyweight ones, the 37.7s and 37.5s, will be used for many years to come. But the rest, I'm afraid, sadly, will be going.
There's been another real winner among the diesels.
By the early 1970s, a train that could reach 125 miles per hour on the straight was running experimentally. It was called HST, the high-speed train, and it was diesel-hauled.
Where would we be without the HST? It's a rainy day in Devon, but the train makes light work of the dreaded Dainton Bank. Come rain or shine, the 100 or so train sets are to be found tirelessly pounding up and down the network at 3-figure speeds where the track permits, the flexible friend of the travelling public for so many years. This one is running along the seawall at Dawlish. But was the diesel era one great big mistake?
I mean, I've heard people say that we should never have gone into diesel at all. We should have jumped straight from steam into electric traction because it's probably cleaner and more efficient. I don't know. Again, I'm on slightly dangerous ground because I'm not really knowledgeable enough.
Some of the finest diesels, like the Peaks, only survive at all today because of the efforts of preservationists who've had to put a brave face on things in recent years. Nowadays, the customers are children, and the mighty warrior that once wandered the Midland, Western and Eastern main lines finds itself tootling up and down the mid-Hants, doubling as devious diesel, the two-faced engine. It's better than extinction. What really rescued the preservation movement, whether the purists like it or not, was Thomas the Tank Engine, the Reverend Awdry's famous character as resurrected by Britt Allcroft. Its phenomenal popularity with children who'd never seen a steam engine was the wonder of the 1980s. They still queue up to meet James or to see Douglas the Black Engine make a quick getaway with an Easter special to Alton. This may look like a U-class engine to you and me. In fact, it may look specifically like engine number 31625, late of Guildford Shed. But to the paying customers, this is Douglas, and the customer is always right. Because it's the customer's pocket money that will pay to put this S15 together again. To 45% of the Mid-Hants' entire annual revenue comes from two Thomas events. Children started the preservation movement, children keep it going. Among the more astonishing achievements in the Heritage era is the saving of a chunk of Great Central Railway in the East Midlands, a main line railway being returned to twin-track running. Or there's that beautiful recreation of the Isle of Wight's Victorian trains by a relatively small band of dedicated railway people. David Shepherd is proud to be the railway's president.
I paid or helped to pay for Calbon, which is now on the Isle of Wight. That lovely little Victorian steam railway. The whole thing is Victorian. That's one of the craziest, stupidest things we ever did, getting rid of steam like we did in this rush to dieselise in the 60s, because if they'd saved all the railway on the Isle of Wight, or most of it, saved all Calbon's sisters, they cut them all up except Calbon and I think one other, they cut them all up for raised roads, threw away all these lovely Victorian coaches. If they'd left the whole lot, my God, that could be one of the biggest tourist attractions in this country now. The rest of the railway system on the Isle of Wight was turned into a modern railway, in inverted commas, by using 1930 underground stock from the Northern Line running to Barnet, you know, and then when they took that onto the Isle of Wight, they found the platforms were all the wrong height, so they had to lower the platform or raise them. Oh, God, crazy. Sorry, I'm so wound up about the stupid things we did in the 60s.
People with long memories in the preservation movement can still remember the rather patronising way they were treated by BR, but take pride in the fact that time has proved them well able to run railways. The Bluebell is a highly successful, multi-million-pound operation nowadays.
Well, I'm sure that the big boys would have looked over their shoulder and smiled and certainly raised their eyebrows and said, yes, that'll be a 5-minute wonder, and they'll move on to something else next when they realise exactly what's involved. And I think that's where, certainly as far as Bluebell was concerned, it has always set itself out to prove its critics wrong, and that it wants to show what can be done. The aim now, and it's our main focus, is to reach East Grinstead, another further 2 miles up the line. Enthusiast specials from up north could come down to here, and we're already thinking that in fact Kingscote will be the place where we'll change locomotives and a steam locomotive will take the visiting train on.
As the 1990s came to a close, steam was re-establishing a role for itself all over the country. On a cold winter's morning, another dedicated team prepares to make railway history. The recently rediscovered Rood Ashton Hall is about to leave Tyseley, turning the famous Birmingham engine shed, now a museum, back into an operational base. Tyseley has long wanted to run steam shuttles to Stratford, giving the people of Birmingham a different option for a day out. On this historic Sunday, Bob Meanley and his men will get their chance.
Today is probably the culmination of a very long-held dream at Tyseley. I think as long as Tyseley has been there, it's wanted to operate Stratford trains on a regular basis. We've done it as special trains in the days when there are permitted occasional trains at bank holidays once every year or whatever. But we've had a tremendous amount of support from Railtrack, from Central Trains, from EWS Railway, from the City of Birmingham, from Stratford District Council, who all want to see these tourist trains succeed. And I think it's one of the marvellous things of privatisation that you're able to actually think about this and talk about it seriously and commercially.
The engine is now in superb condition after more than 30 years sitting around the yard in pieces.
It lay around at Tyseley for an awful long time. We've used it as a barometer really. When Tyseley's been doing well, we've sort of taken the hall out and dusted it off and probably taken a few more bits off it. And when times have got hard, it's gone back into the siding, minus a few more bits. And we made a determined effort about 3 years ago to pick it up with this job in mind, because it's an ideal engine. Really, to use a Castle on a job like this is a bit of overkill with those 4 cylinders whizzing up and down inside the frames of the engine.
The hall's condition is a tribute to the skills of Tyseley's full-time staff, but also to a group of teenagers who've laboured long and hard towards this moment.
There's a tremendous amount of effort being put into this engine by a group of volunteers who are all under the age of 20. 6 individuals in particular, led really, I suppose, by my son Alistair. The most wonderful band of young people you could ever wish to meet, and you know, the quality of things like the boiler casing and a lot of the boiler work has all been done by them.
It's a terribly important day for the Birmingham team. If Rood Ashton Hall performs as they expect, and if the people of the Midlands will support them, the region could have a new tourist attraction that is both a slice of living heritage and a way of easing road congestion. Birmingham has had to rebuild its rail links into Snow Hill Station, but this one link is special. Steam is back. It's a spectacular achievement against the odds by people of courage.
In talking about steam railways particularly, an enormous amount has been achieved by the steam railway fraternity. I mean, I'm told there are about 2 million railway enthusiasts in this country. Not all of them have done perhaps as much as they could, but we have achieved a colossal amount.
A few minutes later, the engine reappears from the other end of the tunnel, running tender first, with express headboard carried jauntily, and the city is bathed in sunlight as if to celebrate a sparkling moment in transport history. Rood Ashton Hall grumbled a bit during the climb back to Birmingham first time round, but it was only like watching someone waking up from a long sleep, and by the end of the day she'd be making light work of the trailing load of 9.
It's been a long time since Tyseley operated as an entity on the main line, and you know, we've taken a lot of our staff and they've performed, in my opinion, faultlessly, professionally, and I'm as proud as hell of them.
The exercise was a great success, but there was more to it than that. It was something about the sky. Britain's last engine was called Evening Star, and that night at Stratford there was just one prominent star which twinkled above the steam and became lost in a shower of sparks as Rood Ashton Hall prepared to go home. David Shepherd believes you have to be mad to restore these steam engines, and says, thank God we are.
I wouldn't live in any other country. This is the finest nation in the world, and one of the things that makes the British so terrific is that we're full of eccentrics. This country is eccentric, full of mad people who think, my God, bugger bureaucracy, damn the money, we're going to do it.
A few months later, a forlorn trio of diesels were standing dead beside the turntable at another former Great Western shed, witnessing another miracle. Note the shed plate, 81A. King Edward I was kicked out of this very shed nearly 40 years ago. The king was dead. Long live the king. But what about tomorrow's engines? Old Oak Common is a shadow of its former self. Will the new generation of locomotives mean a change of fortune for our railways? Surprisingly, perhaps, the answer is almost certainly yes. Freight traffic on the railways is projected to triple in the next 10 years, and that's why new engines are arriving in Britain.
Well, basically, we've got 250 new locomotives which are coming across from Canada, and what you see here are about another 10 of those which have come across the several thousand miles from the Canada and US side to be over here. It's a fantastic operation when you consider they're built, you know, several thousand miles away, brought over here, and within 36 hours of arriving in this country, they're straight to traffic working on trains. They're the state-of-the-art new technology that we've got here, and what they will do is they will enable us to provide more modern and environmentally friendly equipment, which will replace some of the outdated locomotives we've had for many years.
So this is the shape of things to come. But it's a shape the steam enthusiasts are not particularly interested in. At least one steam loco was hauling 2,000 tons years ago, and that was Black Prince.
First train she hauled, loose coupled, up the hill, slightly up the hill, from a dead stop, was 1,600 tons on her own. She did that as though she was not knowing she had anything behind her. Then they put it up to 2,000, and then the last run was 2,364 tons. She did it on her own, and that said something to the diesel fanatics.
However, there is one thing the new engines can do which we should all be pleased about. They can take heavy traffic off the roads. And locomotive number 66064 is about to prove it in style. Her driver is the popular Eastleigh steam expert John Smith.
Everything that I do on this locomotive today will be recorded in here. And we call it, its name is Qtron. It's an onboard computer, and it'll actually put a printout. If my inspector wants to see how I've been behaving for the day, he can tell me what he's going to do, and he can come along and he can download that, and he can get the whole journey. So every action I take on this locomotive, putting the windscreen wipers on, operating the sands, sounding the horn, the brakes, what power levels, settings I've got is all on here. And this is your power handle, and it's got 8 settings on here, well 9 if you can include idle. So it goes from 9, we're not in forward gear, we've got the brakes on, so right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You can hear the engine revving up. It's actually putting power on, so it comes back and we let it die back down, and then we'll shut it off.
The load this morning is empty fuel wagons for the refinery at Fawley, 1,600 tons of them. The Class 37 engine on the left will follow with a second train. One man, working on his own, is about to take 160 lorry loads through the centre of Southampton in the rush hour without inconveniencing anyone on their way to work.
What was that train, John?
There's a Freightliner going through. That's probably the Ripple Lane going up. It's going up to Dagenham in East London. This is a view you get. We're through Southampton Tunnel now, going under the city. There's all them commuters happily going off to work, getting soaking wet, walking across the top. And this is Southampton Central Station as we're coming out through the throat of it. There's Toys R Us on the left. That's where I try and avoid taking my grandson because he costs me a lot of money.
"66064 arrives with her immense train. The cabs are reckoned to be a bit noisy, but to the outside world these engines are incredibly quiet. The train seems to be about 1/4 of a mile long. The second train arrives, with the 37's characteristic growl. This is not the only old equipment around on the rail network. She's in good company. There's still plenty of the slam door stock, which commuters keep hoping is about to disappear. Another relic from the days when there was steam. Years of underinvestment and unfair play, including one government transport minister who'd been a partner in a road building firm, have left our railways in poor shape at the end of the 20th century. But David Shepherd believes we can't go on building roads.
We've got to do something, because with what I'm told in 20 years' time there'll be 2 cars for every car there is now in this country. This country is already one massive great car parking lot, as the Americans would call it. And I fear, I've got grandchildren. My oldest grandchild in a few years' time will be driving, and she'll be sitting on that bloody M25, which was out of date before it was built. She'll be sitting in a gridlock for half her life, and it's crazy. This is why I say I'm glad I'm not being born now.
Many of the modern cross-country trains are simple little affairs, just coaches on rails really, 2 or sometimes even just 1 carriage. And these little trains can seem such a forlorn sight as they come to rest at the commodious platforms of a bygone age. There have, of course, been rail cars in the past, but these are working between major cities because demand for seats, although rising, is still very limited. Gone is the romance and any attempt at stylish design, and it's difficult to imagine great artists trying to capture the magic of these trains on canvas. But perhaps these trains will help railway economics to make more sense. In any event, David Shepherd believes we've got to give the railways a chance, and to give privatisation a chance. Whether people can be weaned out of the motor car, whether the railways can price themselves back into favour, and whether there should be separate ownership of the trains and the trackbed are questions that only time will decide. After a century of trains in decline, there is some good news about passenger numbers, but it's really up to the travelling public what happens next. One really sad thing that can't be denied is that the nation that invented the train is now importing not only its frontline freight engines, but also its foremost passenger express, for Eurostar is a French design. And as if to make matters worse, its prestige terminal has been built at the wrong station, for Waterloo will not be its long-term home. And somehow, even this masterpiece of technology has failed to catch the artist's eye.
It's not beautiful to me, no, because I'd like to see. It's too smooth. It has to be to go that speed. It's got rid of all the sort of kitchen sink bits and pieces all over it, like a steam engine had. I mean, this is purely the artist in me saying this. I have no desire whatever to paint a Eurostar train because I can't get enthusiastic about it. No, I can't. I get excited about modern aeroplanes up to a point, but Concorde, I suppose if I was asked to paint Concorde, I would do it, but I wouldn't have the same enthusiasm that I would if I was asked to paint a Lancaster or a Hurricane or a Spitfire, because that was my generation, and character. I'm very condemning of the modern age, but I'm afraid I belong to an age long since past, and I'm very glad I was born when I was, because I think this age is getting more and more functional, where the only thing matters is the thing works and you throw it away and build another one. As we've seen in this programme, railway development never stands still for very long, and nor should it. And with the start of the new millennium, it's certainly no exception. Several exciting projects have recently been unveiled. And it's interesting to reflect that 2 decades after the advanced passenger train was such a flop for British Rail, the tilting train is back again.
This new generation of tilting trains are based on the well-established Italian Pendolino design and are currently undergoing extensive testing by the builders Alstom at Old Dalby. The body shells are built in Italy, but the bogies and tilt system are made in Switzerland, with all the different sections finally assembled at Birmingham. Eventually, the top speed for these futuristic-looking trains should be 140 miles per hour on Birmingham and Manchester services from London. The Pendolinos can accelerate from 0 to 100 miles per hour in 100 seconds and take bends 20% faster because of their revolutionary 8-degree tilt. If all goes according to plan and the West Coast Main Line is upgraded on time by 2005, journey times will fall by as much as a third, while the frequency of some services will be doubled. It's hoped the new trains, with their vastly increased speed and comfort, will be popular with passengers, as it's forecast that customer figures on the West Coast Main Line will have to double to 30 million a year to help pay for the massive investment in the Pendolinos. The first unit should see service on the London to Manchester route in June 2002. Just in time to carry passengers to the Commonwealth Games. Each train can carry 441 passengers and is equipped with a self-service shop, an in-seat audio entertainment system and toilets for the disabled. Eventually, there'll be a fleet of 53 9-car Pendolino sets in use, allowing vastly improved service levels to Preston, Birmingham and Manchester, and an hourly service to Glasgow. In the meantime, the so-called high-speed trains of the last century are now reaching their silver jubilee. It's worthwhile remembering they were originally conceived as a stopgap measure by British Rail before the proposed wholesale electrification of the nation's main lines. Always popular with the public, the Intercity 125s have proved to be reliable workhorses for their new private owners and can be seen in a variety of fresh liveries. Operated as train sets with interchangeable power cars, they were for many years able to claim to be the fastest diesel trains in the world. As well as being primarily used on non-electrified West Country routes, they can also be seen under the wires on many long-distance services. East Coast mainline services are now operated by GNER. The company was lucky enough to inherit the most modern electric Class 91s, with a potential top speed of 140 miles per hour. Despite setting new standards of service, GNER didn't get the full franchise extension it had hoped for when it and Virgin put in rival bids to operate these lucrative Anglo-Scottish services. The new century has also seen a lot more competition for EWS, the UK's main rail freight operator. Freightliner now operate a stud of similar Class 66 locos and have been steadily expanding their market share. Typical new flows include this daily train load of domestic waste from Bath and Bristol, which is destined for a landfill site at Calvert, near Aylesbury. Perhaps one of the most optimistic recent developments has been the arrival of the brand new 67s, charged with the responsibility of getting long-distance mail trains through on time. One surprising feature of this operation is that it's still possible to post a last-minute letter onto the train. The Class 67s, which are basically high-speed versions of the Class 66, were built by Alstom at their plant in Valencia in Spain. With a top speed of 125 miles per hour, they can be seen on mail trains from the northeast and also South Wales and the West Country. One thing that's certain in this new century is that everyone expects more from our railways than ever before in terms of safety, value for money and reliability.
Of course we have to have motor cars. Of course more and more people inevitably fly from A to B nowadays. But let's forget that railways must and should still play a very important part in our daily lives, whether it's fast, safe, high-speed train travel, commuter travel, or just the sheer joy of travelling by train.